Awesome. Hello. Um, I'm here to talk about salsa. Not the spicy kind, though. It's actually a framework about supply chain security. So, um, we're going to go through what software supply chain security is. We're going to talk about why it matters. We're also going to talk about what salsa is, and then we'll go through some examples of how you can make it. Because there are a lot of components to it. And finally, a little bit of a spicy thing about S-bombs, and I think the sort of domination that they've taken up in the space. But first up, that's me. I'm a senior security engineer at Canva. So I have focused explicitly on software supply chain security for about the last year and a half now. So we have a dedicated team, something quite new. And most importantly, we're not actually placed within the traditional security infrastructure of the organization. We sit within the developer platform team. And this is important because Salsa is really highly tied to your developers and to the platform on which they build. So to start up, let's talk about software supply chain security. It's a pretty new thing, but it's a big thing. Ultimately, software supply chain security is kind of the entirety of everything that makes up the thing you build. Now, this may or may not apply to your organization, but most organizations that have a reasonable technology footprint produce some form of software, some form of code. And the supply chain is everything that contributes to that. So we're talking about processes, systems, code, and most importantly, people, right? Developers build things. Developers are the core thing that we have to worry about in this situation. And to sort of break it down further, it's not just the code you create, it's the code that every other person creates that you pull in, the 10,000 npm packages, the low dashes, all those sorts of things. You use them, they're part of your supply chain. You need to understand them. And it's also the things you build your supply chain with. So we take on the risk of the open source tools we use to build things, and everyone is using open source tools, even in a commercial setting. So it's pretty key. It's everything. And I really hate the idea that this has been boiled down to an ingredients list, because it's a lot more than just an ingredients list. It's also the way that these ingredients are made. It's the way that those ingredients are put together. It's the process we take to make it. So it's like a combination of a recipe and an ingredients list. And of course, we've got this thing. We've got to secure it, right? So, yes, security as a word, sure. But ultimately, we are recording the things that make things up. And I think this is where we need to focus our most intense efforts on, which is sometimes we can't prevent things. We can sign, we can validate. But as long as we record the process that produced the thing, the artifact, the piece of software, we can then trace when something's gone wrong as well. And that is a core part of software supply chain security, is recording what you've built, how it was built, when it was built, and being able to execute upon that in the situation that something's gone wrong. And most importantly, being the rusty wheel, detecting when something isn't quite right and being able to alert and monitor and things like that. So, of course, we're going to talk about the risk. Why does this matter? Why do we care about this? And we've all heard the SolarWinds breach talked about a million times. I'm not going to belabor it. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But the point is that supply chain risk is real. Software supply chain security does breach organizations. It does pop organizations, and it happens all the time. We've got tons of malicious packages in our public repositories, and that's only the surface of the kind of issues we can see. There are just so many organizations that are not prepared for this, and it shows. So CrowdStrike does its global security attitude survey. 45% of respondents had a supply chain attack in the last 24 months. And this is a tiny sample size as well, ultimately, but it's quite extensive. And of those that had the attack, 59% of them didn't have a way to stop it or respond to it. And that in itself is horrifying. That really demonstrates the iceberg that we face right now. We've got all these things that we do not control, and we have no clue how to stop them from popping us. And the threats never end. These are just a list of some of the most common ones. And most importantly, all of these could have been prevented through the use of something like Salsa. We've got people pushing things to repositories, or my favorite one, the event stream one, which was a public dependency was added to an open source application. Then later on, that dependency was converted from nothing to malicious. That then goes out, everyone's got that there, but most importantly, no one noticed until it was far, far, far too late. Luckily in this case, I believe it was just a crypto miner, so lost CPU cycles. There's a lot worse things to happen, but that could be a lot worse for a company. Cool. So now we are sufficiently scared or sufficiently not concerned, that's fine, but what can we do to fix this in the future? So this is where SLSA comes in. SLSA is that, it's supply chain levels for software artifacts. We don't ever use the full term in supply chain security, we just say SLSA. It's too hard to say the whole thing all the time. But it is a principles-based vendor-neutral framework. It's basically a way of incrementally improving things. And I love incremental improvement. It's a lot easier to sell internally. It is a lot harder to execute upon internally sometimes because positive assertions for things like performance reviews and stuff can be difficult. But it is important that you incrementally improve things because it's too hard to just turn a switch on. And when a vendor says they can just turn a switch on and secure it, they're trying to sell you something, right? So let's do this incrementally. The other really important part about SLSA though is that it gives you a vocabulary to talk about this new thing. So we don't really have a standard way of talking about it. SLSA kind of tries to do that, which I think is its biggest selling point ultimately, beyond just the checklist. Because, you know, we spend a lot of time working on checklists. And honestly, I wouldn't say we've seen a net security improvement by having checklists. So, of course, that vocabulary is important, as I was saying. It brings in a lot of different things. The first two, provenance and attestation, I'll talk about those specifically on the next slide. But the three sort of main bits or components of your supply chain are sources. That's things that you typically write yourself. So it's not your third-party code. We do talk about dependencies as a separate entity, but we know what dependencies are. But sources are the things that you start out at. It's what we push into the supply chain initially. So that could be a git commit. That could be, well, hopefully it's a git commit. Hopefully you're not just writing things out manually, but it's in your VCS, right? The build is the time when we take the source, we add things to it, we modify it. It's the process that creates the final outcome, which is the package. Now that package could be a Docker image, that package could be a Debian archive, it could be a tarball, it doesn't really matter. It can also be a no-op, it doesn't have to output an archive, but ultimately we are creating something. There's an output for this process, and that is a key component of every build lifecycle. As I said, I was going to mention provenance separately. So provenance is probably the weirdest word in the new vocabulary. It's something that's largely been associated with the art world and also the supply chain world pre-software. But we're talking about something more than just SBOMs. Now, SBOMs are part of provenance. We do need to record the things that make up something, but as I said, it's also the way that your artifact is made. It's the bits and bobs that you glue together and then the way you glue them together. And provenance should capture that. It should also capture the input and output, as well as any processes that inject or interact with the components within it. Now, I will go into what provenance looks like traditionally later on, what it is, some frameworks and ways to do it. But I think it's important that we sort of call this out at the beginning, that it's important to have more than just a list of what's in there. We have to talk about the way it's made, because otherwise we can't determine weaknesses. We can't ensure orthodoxy. Cool. So SLSA, as I said, is principles-based. It has three main principles. Some of these aren't particularly unique. We sort of heard a lot of them before. The first one being that we trust a minimal subset of platforms and we verify the things that come out of them. That's essentially the core thesis of zero trust. We don't trust the things we build in. We don't trust any environment. Ultimately, high trust platforms are really hard, but we also kind of have to trust them at some point too. So the idea is that we assume we're always doing something in a malicious environment. There's always potentially problems you can face, but also we kind of try to minimize them as much as possible, but it's not the core focus. The next step is to go, trust code, not individuals. Now, the reasoning behind this is that SLSA really dislikes the concept of developers doing any of the building themselves. We shouldn't be pushing binaries or container images from developer laptops at any stage or at any point, because you ultimately cannot enforce things on an end user computer. It's hard enough to enforce things on a CI agent, whether it's a container or not. It is hard enough to do that. We cannot trust end user computers. Code is something we can verify and analyze. We can look at what pipelines did. We can understand how they did it. It makes getting provenance a lot easier. And also avoiding individual mistakes. We are able to say, it happened this way, precisely. And then the third and probably the most unique principle is the concept of preferring attestation over inference. We infer a lot about the security state of environments. The entirety of modern infrastructure, especially infrastructure as code, is based off inference. We have something go out. It may check the state, but a lot of the times it relies on the state not having changed and just sort of assumes and does things. SLSA hates that. We do not want to have to rely on things like access control. We don't want to have to trust state. Unless we can verify it and cryptographically verify it, we do not trust it. We have to be able to see from start to finish that it was made in a certain way. Part of that is the creation of a model. So SLSA takes those principles and builds a model. It's a pretty standardized model, the directed acyclic graph. It's something that's very common in software. It may not be something we look at in security a lot, but most CI processes would be considered directed acyclic graphs. Ultimately, it's a collection of sources, builds, dependencies, and packages, and your supply chain is made up of a whole bunch of these, because every package, every piece of software you consume is one of these DAGs, and you are responsible for not necessarily controlling them, but understanding them. It's within your best interest to understand the way the things you consume are made. Similar to how we don't want to eat things made in a dirty kitchen, we don't want to consume open source dependencies that are built on a random person's laptop somewhere else in the world. So we take all this and we come up with things that we can do. This is the checklist. This is the core levels of SLSA. So it has currently got one main track. There's more to come. This is the build track, they call it. It doesn't talk a lot about source integrity at the moment. We'll kind of hopefully see more about that soon. But it has 3 main levels. Technically 4 if you count level 0. Level 0 is where we are today. It's where we don't do verification, and we don't do this and we don't do that. I'll go in more into what the levels are. But fundamentally, you'll probably find your organization has bits and bobs from each of the levels. That is expected. But you do not reach the level until you have everything. And usually the barrier to that is level 1. It seems like it's the easiest, but very few people have provenance. We might have SBOMs. We might have paid a vendor to generate SBOMs for us. But SBOMs don't cut it. Like I said, it needs to be something that covers the entirety of the process. It needs to be the platform, the CI process, everything, all the way down. You should be able to map everything all the way down. And this is a really hard thing to do, right? I'll go through some tooling and stuff that can make this a little bit easier later on. But it's not easy. Level 1 is actually a lot of work. To get this stuff together, to get this information together can be quite difficult. And the other part is the distribution of it. So level 1's biggest shortfall is the fact that you create all this provenance, but then you just kind of throw it out, like you use it, but you just don't do anything to make sure it's correct. You don't verify it, you don't sign it, you don't do anything with it. You do give it to your consumers or customers, but they can't really trust it because you haven't gone to the process of signing it. So this is where level 2 comes in. So they call level 2 hosted build platform. It's everything in level 1, but you have to have a build platform that runs on dedicated infrastructure. So no more developers' laptops. And the provenance is tied to, cryptographically, that infrastructure. So that is typically done in the form of a signing process. I'll go through some tooling again about that later on, but you can use machine identities and OIDC identities to basically say, this person started this build, this agent ran it, and this is cryptographically verifiable. You can follow that path all the way through. The other addition is the fact that we then now verify provenance. So we actually look at it and say, okay, this is correct. It is signed, it is valid, it contains all the information we thoroughly need to say that this is authentic. Of course, though, we aren't done. We have the last little bit left, right, which is hardened builds. So a core problem in software is the concept of reproducibility or hermeticity, depending on what engineer you speak to. The theory that you can always produce the same output given the same inputs. This is kind of what hardened builds talks about. It takes the concept of reproducibility and makes it a security thing. So we have to introduce strong controls that prevent concurrent runs, so multiple CI jobs, multiple builds, from interfering with each other. Some of that you get for free. If anyone's using like GitHub Actions or container-based CI builds, you kind of get it for free. If you use any form of caching, it's questionable, right? How do you ensure that there are no side effects from that caching? It's a really hard problem to solve. For example, we at Canva use Bazel. Bazel is all about caching and reusing components, and that makes this a really hard level to reach for us because we have to work out the intent and the output of those caches. It has some cryptographic verification in it, but it's really hard. The other component is level 2 doesn't talk about how you prevent developers from modifying this process, and neither does level 1. We leave that for last because it's already hard enough to get all these new things introduced and change the workflow that we really don't want to make it too much of a barrier to developers initially. But at the end of the day, we kind of got to stop this stuff from being modified. Signing secrets, provenance generation, even the CI scripts that you use, the CI components that you use to create and sort of generate this provenance, that can't be something that can be modified by developers. We have to protect it, and it has to be audited. And you may even talk about the SOC 2 sort of dual approver kind of thing. Like, whatever that process is, there has to be that level of control over it. Cool. So now we talked about what makes up SLSA, the bits, the levels, and sort of now it's time to talk about the ways that we can sort of practically implement it. So we're all sick of hearing about compliance stuff, and that's okay. But we're going to talk about the real technical controls, the things that actually do stuff within SLSA. So I kind of break it down to 3 main technical controls, right? We've got provenance, which is all about visibility, transparency, and identifying tampering, identifying times at which we have problems. It allows us to identify stuff quite easily. And then we have signing and attesting. So this is about creating a relationship between anything we produce and the metadata about it. We get that strong relationship. And we also get a strong relationship between the producers of artifacts and the consumers of artifacts because they can follow that root of trust all the way through. And most importantly, it really increases the cost of compromise now because any form of tampering requires cryptographic, messing around with the cryptographic nature of it. You have to avoid signing. Well, it's really easy if you were in a container environment. You just block those containers from running if they don't pass the signature check. Easy. We can do the same thing on bare metal, on instances, whatever we need to do. The technology doesn't matter. The point is that when we have cryptographic trust, they have to either compromise the machinery that verifies that trust or find a way to work around it, get in earlier. It's really just about increasing the cost of a compromise. And then finally, hardened isolated builds. This is something that your infrastructure teams or CI teams will probably be pretty keen to do anyway, but we should be able to not trust what we're running on and kind of not care about what we're running on so that we can make better quality artifacts. It shouldn't matter what environment you build this thing in. It should be the same thing every time. And we should have really low level baselines. Now, we've all heard the talk about things like scratch images and all that sort of stuff. for all the boringness about them, they're actually incredibly useful things, because by reducing the amount of stuff that's in your supply chain, your provenance is more simple. Your way of building things is more simple, and there's less chance of unintended side effects and unintended consequences. Cool. Tooling time. So there is a lot of really, really great open source tooling. I'm going to avoid as much as I can talking about vendor side tooling, because to be honest, a lot of vendor side tooling is using a lot of this stuff under the hood, and we really want to sort of talk about openness and encourage the lowest common denominator, everyone to be able to access this. And a lot of this stuff is actually really easy to use. I'll show later on some concepts from GitHub Actions, for example, that make this a single switch you can turn on for your project if you're using GitHub Actions. It's really powerful. So to go back to SBOMs, we start with them. That's the first form of provenance because it's the easiest. So Anchor publish a tool called Sift. It's open source. It allows you to generate SBOMs based off file systems of containers, dependency closures, anything like that. It's a lot harder if you're using an EC2 instance or some sort of AMI thing. That is a bit harder. You may need to be publishing your own dependency closure listings to use Sift. But it allows you to sort of get a baseline, because at least it's going to capture all of your open source and third-party stuff, because that is kind of the largest part of your risk. You can produce your own SBOMs through your own products. That's easy to do. You can combine that with language-specific tools. So depending on what ecosystem or language you work in, there are tons of tools you can find for specific languages that allow you to create SBOMs based on the structure of your project. Once we've got an SBOM, we need to talk about the things that made it up. And that's where InToto comes in. They have a tool called Witness. Witness allows you to basically take your existing CI/CD infrastructure and just wrap the commands you run in the Witness tool. That will automatically monitor the processes that launch, monitor the network ports that are open, everything associated with what you're doing, depending on what operating system you're on, and will create provenance for it. You will get a blow-by-blow of every system and every input that interacted specifically with that tool, with that thing you're building. We kind of course, need to actually associate that with it. So the provenance that you've produced needs to be associated with the artifact. So this is where signing and attesting comes in. Again, entirely open source. There's some really cool stuff out there. You may or may not have heard of the SigStore process, the SigStore project. It is an insanely cool project. It allows you to have a CA that only produces short-lived certificates. Those certificates exist for approximately 10 minutes, and then they're gone. So you can sign your stuff. You never have to worry about certificate compromise. It doesn't exist long enough, and it uses a transparency log called Record to provide you with a way to verify the validity of that signature. It also uses an IDP as an identity anchor, which is a really, really cool way of saying that you don't need to trust the little bit of thing that's running it. You can trust IDPs. Now, IDPs aren't entirely trustworthy, but we all trust them. Let's be honest. We've all got an Okta or something. We kind of have to have some point of trust. But it is a really, really cool thing. If you publish an open source tool, you can use the free instance of SigStore. You can do it for your own stuff. I would recommend not doing that. It's a public transparency log. So every bit of email, every bit of code, you don't want that in a public log that someone can crawl. We've seen the kinds of things that can be pulled out of CT logs on the internet already. You probably don't want your software signatures up there. You can deploy your own though. They provide a Helm chart. There's also some really good guides about deploying SigStore on bare metal. But once you've got SigStore in place, you can use Cosign. Cosign is the CLI tool that interacts with SigStore. It will not only let you attach provenance to your container images, to arbitrary blobs, to executables, whatever you're producing, literally any form of matter on a computer you can attach a signature to, but it will also allow you to do attestation. The cryptographic verification of the fact that you've done that. You're stamping it saying, this happened, this process was built this way, and I'm telling you that with this really strong cryptographic signature. And then finally, builds. This is the easiest part. This is where if you can use GitHub Actions, you can pretty much just turn on SLSA Level 3. They have pre-built actions that will automatically track the entirety of everything you do in the build. It'll generate SBOMs. It will do everything, depending on what languages you use, of course. You will still need to deploy a SigStore instance because you don't want it going to the public instance, but super powerful. If you're in the GCP world, we have the Google Software Delivery Shield. Again, you're able to do up to SLSA level 3 compliant builds. And the best part about the SDS is the open source assured library, which Google has taken the top approximately 1,000 libraries from the most popular languages, and they do verification and security patching for you. And this is something that is available to any GCP customer, and you can consume it as is. The other part of builds, if you can't use these two things, I'm sorry, but we do have the option to make our builds a lot easier to do this within. So this is the only slide I really am going to talk heavily about vendors. The option we've got is chain guard images. So a lot of you have probably heard of distro list container images. Chain guard is like the next step of the distro list image. So they publish an entire public catalog of images. You can pay to access them as well to get older versions and things, but they have an incredibly low CVE count. 97% of their images have 0 CVEs that are currently known. So it's an extremely cool process, but most importantly, they have SLAs, even for the public images, about how quickly the vulnerabilities get resolved. So it's a really, really powerful tool that you can just use. And for most things, you can just drop it in. If you've got an AWS CLI container running somewhere, drop the chain guard image instead. It's not that often that the AWS CLI breaks things when it updates, unless they release a new version of something, and reInvent is coming up. So there is a possibility that will happen, but the point is that easy things can be dropped in. So I think that's sort of the main part of this. The core crux of that is that there are a lot of things out there that you can use to make this easier. You can go chat with vendors, and there are really great vendors in this space, but if you've got a large enough team, there's no reason to. Now, the final bit is a bit of a spicy one. Don't fall for the SBOM hype. SBOMs are important, but they are not supply chain security. I think there is an idea at the moment that if we just put an SBOM in, we're good. And a lot of requirements that are coming from governments such as the US government are really blurring and muddying the waters about that. The idea that you are considered secure the moment you have an SBOM. And it's really important that we don't get caught up in that. Focus on the overall process, the fact that you are there to record things and get all the information about what you're doing, because really this is about visibility. SBOMs are a little bit of visibility, but they don't tell you anything about how the thing was made. They don't tell you anything about the kitchen it was made in. So that's me. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Wonderful, thanks, Ben. I got a question over there.
I'm just wondering, do you see the possibility for there to start being more attacks against this kind of software assurance infrastructure as opposed to build infrastructure or code as this becomes more common?
Yeah, 100%. I'm sure supply chain security will spawn supply chain security. But yeah, I think if we take the model of the things we put here and produce these things the same way, like produce that infrastructure the same way we produce the infrastructure and code that we're supposed to be producing, I think it kind of has a little bit of an effect against that. But 100%, I would not be surprised if you started to see concerted attacks against things like SigStore instances. It goes back to the fact that no single branch of security can stand on its own. We need to sort of work as a collective, and I just think this is a really important missing piece at the baseline to go, we have all this stuff stacked on top, and we have the zero trust, and we have all that stuff, but then we just kind of trust everything that drops into our Git repo kind of blindly. So yeah, great point, that the more we focus on this, the more adversaries are going to focus on it.
Hey buddy, great presentation.
Thank you, Ben, for the great talk. You said that you continuously get patches from Google patching framework. How do you keep track of the patch software in the SBOM? Because you continuously have a different kind of fork. If you have the patch stream inside of your code base.
Yeah, so the good thing about Google or open software assured is that they publish VEX information. So VEX is a way of sort of patching SBOMs in post is the way I look at it. It's to say, yeah, this is a version that is the same as this upstream version. However, we have fixed these vulnerabilities. So I didn't talk about VEX today, but VEX is another component that is becoming more and more common. I think it's because it's kind of shared across the board. I would strongly recommend checking out VEX, especially for your internal services. OpenVEX is an incredibly powerful tool you can use to publish your own vulnerability information.
I'll start over. So one of the concerns with SBOMs, as you point out, is that they typically don't capture any information about the build and the additional processes. So what are your feelings about something like the Cyclone DX project, where they're kind of evolving SBOM to include things now like third-party APIs and third-party services and cloud components, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so I think that the Cyclone DX project has the right idea in making the standard extensible and being able to capture more and more things. I think the reality is that the SLSA project and the supply chain community haven't 100% settled on what the right format for attestation is, for provenance is. So we've kind of, in toto is essentially an SBOM that implements Cyclone DX that has a bunch of components you can put in. There are different formats you can print out, but that's exactly right. So when I say SBOMs, I think I'm more talking about the standard software bill of materials. I think Cyclone DX is moving more towards like a holistic approach, an application level approach or a service level approach, which I really like, but I think there is still the gap of where we capture the precise steps, because in toto actually captures the executable that was run and the disk processes. You can go very deep with how far you want to go. I've also seen talk about using, for example, eBPF monitoring to track processes when they're executing so that you can then get an idea precisely of what's happening in your build process. The problem we get then is we have exactly the same problem that incident response and SOC teams have, which is just too much damn information and we have no way of doing anything with it. So I think it's kind of key that we kind of get it to the level where it's useful and then stop it there because otherwise we won't be able to do anything with it.
So a quick question on supply chain security, which comes back to, I suppose, the contracts you have with your suppliers themselves. What is your opinion when it comes to how you do assurance activity or testing in terms of who owns the intellectual property of the code that you're talking about? For example, would you say if the vendor owns the intellectual property there, in the contract it should say they're responsible for testing and assurance activities, and then you are responsible for any changes you made, but you should be own the intellectual property of changes you made for that product and therefore do the testing? Is it directly related to who owns intellectual property as to the rec security controls and influence, as in where your security budget goes to testing? Or is it a bit more nuanced than that?
I think it's extremely nuanced, right? So it is really difficult to parse out who owns what. I think contracts are your best friends here. And it's also the acknowledgement that your supply chain is never going to be perfect. So it is a risk balance thing, as most things are in cyber. We want to go, okay, this vendor owns all this stuff. They're not particularly great on supply chain security. However, we can then make sure that everything else from that point forth we care about. As to where the specific divide is, unfortunately, there's no easy answer. In your case, in the case of like I'm acquiring something and the vendor has got ability for me to modify it, or I'm paying for like Azul or something like that. So, for example, an open source version of Java repackaged that I can apply patches to. Yeah, you probably own the patches, you own the process of the patches, and I would make sure that you have control over that because you may find yourself in a hard spot otherwise. But fundamentally, this call out goes to both vendors and consumers, right? We're all kind of vendors and consumers at the end of the day. Even vendors are consumers. So the argument is that the focus should be such that it kind of doesn't matter who owns it, because the standard should be everyone does the supply chain security thing. Today, we're just going to have black holes in there. That's ultimately it. So it's going to be owned by a vendor. We don't have an SBOM, we don't have provenance, we don't have VEX. But we should start expecting that in the contracting process, right? We should be calling it out and going, hey, this is expected by the authorities in the US now. This is going to be expected by the EU. Why don't we have this information? Why aren't we getting this? So I think that is a sort of primer to go, ask your vendors, why don't you have an SBOM? Why don't you publish it? And then you can kind of wonder if their build process is just too dirty for you to actually be able to do that as well. Like, it might give you an insight into how hygienic your vendors are too.
Thank you very much, Ben. And give a round of applause.
Thank you.